Thank you very much. And thank you to Ray, Saman, and Matt for joining us today. This panel is going to be on the application of artificial intelligence technologies. I imagine many of our listeners were participating in the last panel, which was the governance and ethics and politics around AI. But we're going to try and get closer to the actual usage of these technologies and what it means for business models, investors, and consumers. So without further ado, I want to give each of our three panelists, 1 to 2 minutes to give a very quick intro to their background and what their current viewpoint is, their perspective on the world with regards to AI, just so there's some context what we talk about going forward. With that said, why don't we start with Ray?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Ray. I'm the creator and co-host of a podcast and actually newsletter, plus other media we're working on called Tech Buzz China. And we are part of the SupChina podcast network. So I know Bob very well. I've also known him for a long time since when I used to live in Beijing and Shanghai for 8 years. From 2007 to 2015. I have a background in, I studied electrical engineering in college and then subsequently went on to work in finance, but focusing on technology on both that advisory as well as venture capital side. And lately what I've been working on is the podcast. We do focus on a lot of large scale consumer internet companies, not specific to AI, but basically you'll see that at least in China, most of these large companies do use some sort of AI. So I will be able to talk to that a little bit.
Great. We'll go to Saman.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. Really excited about everybody on board. I currently run all of the non-China investments for Baidu Ventures. We're about an $800 million series of funds focused on specifically AI applications. So we invest a lot in AI applied to manufacturing, construction, agriculture, healthcare, biotech, etc. Prior to I was an entrepreneur. I built companies and sold two and crashed and burned in the other one. And I also started my own venture fund before this, an incubator called Comet Labs. And we're working on incubating and building startups around AI as well. Before that, I lived in China for off and on for about 16 years altogether. So I've been kind of bouncing back and forth between the US and China for most of my life.
Great, thanks. And now we'll go to Matt.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Sheehan. I'm a fellow at the Paulson Institute's think tank, Macro Polo, and my research there focuses on the US and Chinese AI ecosystems, looking at where they compete, where they collaborate, and especially lately, the work has been a lot of trying to build metrics, ideally grounded in data, for comparing the two ecosystems, comparing the research talent that's working in both ecosystems and the amount of data available and stuff like that. So that's my research background. I lived in China 2010 to 2016, worked as a foreign correspondent there for a couple of years, and then spent much of the last few years working on the connections between China and California. I wrote a book on that topic called The Trans-Pacific Experiment. That got me into Silicon Valley China connections, and that got me into US-China AI. So that's my background.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody. And likewise, I spent a lot of my career living in China, about 10 years, kind of bouncing back and forth during that time. And since I came back to the States, between management consulting and venture back and the inside. So anyway, let's dive in. The first question I want to ask is for Saman, and it's actually not a China-related question, but I just want to set the kind of context for our listeners because it can sometimes be confusing. What is your criteria for defining artificial intelligence compared to just like super high compute power regular math or regular computing? Because there's a lot of things on the application side or the consumer side that AI powered has become like you can't raise money if you're not AI powered, right? But a lot of things aren't actually artificial intelligence. And so just so when we talk about AI applications, where is the threshold that we start to consider things actually AI?
Yeah, I think there's a quote, I can't remember at the moment who it was from, but I think it was one of these famous AI researchers. And they said the problem with AI is as soon as it works, we don't call it AI anymore. So all of these kind of mathematical and statistical models that you're talking about, 10 years ago were all definitely considered AI. Now that they work well enough and reliably enough, we don't consider them AI anymore. So I don't particularly find it to be a very useful term to call something AI or not AI. Generally, what we look for when we're thinking about, or like when we say we invest in AI companies, what we really mean is we invest in companies that do essentially kind of make better decisions in an automated way. So they use data from the physical world or from the digital world. They process it in a very high throughput way, usually at a speed and level of detail that human minds are not able to comprehend. Use that information to make decisions and then act on those decisions either through robotic systems or through instructions to human workers or whatever it might be. We kind of think of that entire loop as quote unquote AI. What specific techniques they employ to get that done is not as important, although most of the things that are at the boundaries of that right now are related to neural networking, but that's only one kind of piece. There's a lot of other things that fall under AI that may be just statistical methods and may not be.
Got it. Thank you for that. I'm gonna go to next with the question. You've done a lot of great research on collaboration between the U.S. and China on AI, usually in upstream context, at least the things that I read put out, like the Microsoft research lab based in, I think, Beijing, where some of the really wonderful breakthroughs in AI come from. That's about as much of a U.S.-China collaboration as you can get. But coming downstream to the actual business models of operating companies, how much collaboration or dependency are we seeing? Like, how many China-based companies rely on access to consumers, their businesses? How many U.S. AI startups rely on? Like, how many U.S. startups have China in their pitch deck? Or is it pretty insulated ecosystems when it comes to issues versus research?
Sure. The audio was a little bit garbled on my end, so I might have missed some details on that front, but I'll do my best to answer as I understood it. So in terms of the interconnectivity of the ecosystems, I tend to try to break it down into a couple different dimensions, namely people, money, ideas, and then maybe you can make a fourth one as like markets or products. And I think a lot of the history of the last 10 years, say 2010 to like 2017 especially, was this period where you had really deep integration between the two ecosystems along the people, along the money, and along the ideas. You had tons of flow of Chinese researchers into Silicon Valley. You had a certain amount of flow of, say, Chinese-born researchers with experience in Silicon Valley going back to China. You had companies like Baidu setting up research labs here, Google trying to set up AI research labs in Beijing. So this flow of people, ideas, and also to a certain extent money was really rich for that 2010 to 2017 period. And I see the current decoupling as an attempt to basically pull all these connections apart. It's sort of all these connections in a lot of ways happened at just like a person-to-person or a researcher-to-researcher level or company-to-company level. And this attempt to decouple the ecosystems is very much like a Washington-led attempt to sort of reassert its role, reassert what it sees as like a national security imperative on all these flows. So I'd say it was very easy to pull apart the money flows. Changes to CFIUS on the US side made it a lot harder for Chinese companies to invest in Silicon Valley. The Chinese capital controls also hurt that even further back to 2015. The flows of people, the markets themselves were never, I would say, very integrated. You have very few US consumer tech companies, especially like information platform companies that are successful in China, and likewise China into the US, TikTok notwithstanding. I know Ray will speak to that. So what I see as kind of the remaining connections that are the stickiest and that are the hardest to pull apart, and some would say maybe the most meaningful, are the connections of people and of ideas, of like the intellectual community of AI. So the piece of research that you referenced there is kind of speaking that directly. I studied Microsoft Research Asia, a leading global AI research lab, and the breakthrough that they made in 2015, known as ResNet, basically allows researchers to stack more and more layers on their neural networks, thus making them more powerful. And it's the kind of thing that it was discovered by a group of 4 Chinese researchers who had never trained in the US, working in Beijing at a US company, and then was immediately released to the entire world in the form of an academic paper, a hugely influential one. It was the most cited academic paper in any field over the last 5 years. So those connections are a lot harder to pull apart, partly because there's a strong, a culture in the academic intellectual community that academic research should be published openly. You see even a certain amount of this at the companies, within companies like Google or Baidu, where they have a commitment to publishing a certain amount of their research. So I'd say that's the kind of the stickiest part of the AI ecosystems that's still touching. It doesn't get exactly into products directly. It doesn't get exactly into sort of the nitty gritty of applications, but I'd say it's kind of like the last thing standing that's really firm in the area of US-China connections on AI ecosystems.
Great, thank you for that. The next question is going to be for Ray here. You mentioned to me that you'd seen a list put out by CB Insights of the 100 most influential, or I don't know, biggest AI companies around the world, and only 6 were Chinese. I was wondering, and I think those 6 are either the entirety of or part of what's often dubbed the national team in China. So I'm curious the lineup there between the 6 Chinese companies mentioned this and the China national team, it's called. And if you could kind of talk about you saw common among those, sort of how they're featured. Are they companies?
Yeah, you're slightly garbled there a little bit, Bobs, but I think I got the most of the question, which is the CB Insights list that I was talking about. But actually, that is separate from the China national team, which I can also go over really briefly. Since this panel is on, AI applications, I thought it was important to sort of highlight what are some of the largest companies in China that are pure AI building. And the list by CB Insights is interesting in many ways. Number one, I don't know if this audience is familiar with CB Insights, but it's a very well-respected research platform. It's actually a software SaaS business. It sells its research and AI-driven insights to many firms, as well as probably think tanks and whatnot. And actually last year, they announced their first, I guess, official collaboration with a Chinese similar insight platform called Deep Tech. So this newest list, I guess, has more of has input from their Chinese counterparts, whereas previously the list they had before, I think, were completely driven by the New York-based CB Insights team. And even though there are only 6 companies on this list, all of them are actually unicorns. And it's interesting what businesses they serve, right? So I'll just name a few of the companies: SenseTime, E2 Tech, Megvii, which recently refiled for a Hong Kong IPO, and that's a Face++ company, if you know it by their product name. There's also 4Paradigm and Momenta and Pony AI. So of the first 3 I mentioned, those are all actually companies whose primary business is serving other enterprises or actually the government. So CB Insights actually lists them as in the government category because that's a lot of where their customer base is, whether directly or intermediately. And then only so Momenta and Pony AI, both self-driving startups, and then for Paradigm. And maybe someone can talk about it later, but 4Paradigm is the only sort of fintech, very clearly business, is only serving business unicorn on here. And I thought that was really interesting to point out versus a lot of the applications you see on this top 100 list that are US based. By the way, they actually did put Pony.ai as a US based company, but if you look into the management team, it's really primarily a Chinese management team, and they're based in both Silicon Valley and New York. So I thought that was really interesting.
Just checking in here. Bob, is Ray frozen on your screen?
She's frozen on my screen as well.
Likewise.
Maybe we can continue the conversation. She'll come back on.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to give it one more second, but yeah, let's go on. So, I want to circle back to Matt and ask a question. We published an article at SupChina about 2 or 3 months ago. A former Apple exec in China wrote it for us, and he had been in some meetings with Huawei executives at when he was based in China, who were kind of bragging, not in a weird way, a way that anyone would, about how they got to train their AI on vast government data sources. And just saying, like, isn't this cool, basically amongst engineers. And it begs the question, will the notion of a national team, which exists in most industries in China, whenever the stock market in China is sitting there, nice and buoyant when Western markets are going up and down, it's widely believed to be the hand of the national team, the kind of group of companies that are either officially or unofficially working in collaboration with the government. I wouldn't say controlled by, but, they're coordinating their actions. Do we see that in the development of actual technologies at the application end as well? And does it provide, a drag on those companies, or is it a benefit to those Chinese companies if they get to do things like that?
So I can't speak to the specific article or Huawei's sort of claim of the large data set. Maybe I would speak, and I believe actually Huawei's not even on the Chinese national team technically. It doesn't have its own pillar, although it's definitely closely tied in there. So in terms of the national team designation itself, I believe that came down the first time in November of 2017. So about 4 or 5 months after the national Chinese next generation AI plan was released. And what I heard and what kind of corresponds with my reading and understanding of the companies is that while the Chinese government, or I think it was the Ministry of Science and Technology, was officially sort of crowning these companies and giving them their own purview. It said, Tencent, you do healthcare; Alibaba, you do smart cities; iFlyTech, you do voice and speech; Baidu, you do autonomous driving. In a lot of ways, that was more of a, it's an honorary title that was given that kind of reflected the reality of these companies' position in these fields already. That's not a pure thing to say that it means nothing, but I would say instead of being a driver of their place in the field, it was more the attempt of the government to kind of like put their official blessing on it. Now that does have implications going forward. Since that period of time, Alibaba has been able to sign a lot more smart city contracts to do its Ali City Brain with cities all over China and even outside of China. I believe Kuala Lumpur has signed a contract with them for a smart city. So there are, I'd say that a government blessing in that way, in some ways it might ease the way forward when it comes to government procurement and contracts. A local official might feel more comfortable giving out a contract to a specific company in a specific arena if they know that it has this sort of blessing from the central government, so they won't be at fault if it goes wrong. But I wouldn't see the national team distinction as kind of a driver in that department. On the issue of training on large pools of data, I think it can be a little bit of a misnomer. I think there's a big picture sense among people who aren't very familiar with the Chinese tech companies or the data they train on, that there's some, giant ocean of data that the Chinese government has locked up, and it just lets, its companies come in and swim freely in that data. I think that's that does not have a real basis in reality. They might have access to large amounts of data because they sign a contract and carry out services. So if you're a facial recognition company or a computer vision company like Megvii or SenseTime, by virtue of the fact that you sign contracts with local governments throughout the country to carry out facial recognition out there, you are going to be increasing your training set of data. But yeah, I wouldn't think of it so much as like they are crowned a national champion and then they just get to swim in infinite amounts of data.
Makes sense. Saman, the next question I have is,
I
You
think
know,
maybe just before the question, I'd love to comment just quickly on
oh,
what Matt
please,
said, because
absolutely. Yeah, if you
I
guys want
think
to jump in, just jump in.
thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with what Matt's saying. I think one thing I just wanted to kind of emphasize here was that, like anybody who's built a technology company or built like technology knows that there's no such thing as kind of a crown champion, right? Like ultimately, like it's such a fast-paced world that there's no static end goal that you can reach and then you can declare victory. It's really a continuous development process, and any company that wants to succeed, whether it's in China or anywhere else, needs to aggregate talent, needs to aggregate data, needs to aggregate and continuously develop. And it's like a competitive and a collaborative process where every company in the world publishes their work on AI, and companies around the world see that and use that as a way to continue to develop, and then they publish that back to the so everybody benefits from collaboration. And I think like there is this tendency in the U.S. to talk about Chinese technology companies as being very like favor, like having gotten a lot of favors from the government and things like that. And for sure, in cases that's definitely true. But I think that in general, for them to survive, as for any technology company, the real thing that's most necessary is like continuous innovation and talent. And I think that that's happening in a really aggressive way in China, as well as in the U.S., as well as many other countries in the world.
Great. It looks like we have Ray back.
Welcome back.
Yeah, sorry, my internet just, I don't know, reset itself.
We're testing the limits of society's bandwidth, I guess. Cool. So the next question that I wanted to ask for Saman was, out of all the industries out there, you're looking at them, which ones stand to benefit the most from AI, where we're at right now with the technology or in the near future? And do you see China, the US, or anywhere else doing a better job of realizing those gains in real ways, versus just kind of well-funded startups that are trying, but actually ones that are creating a change in the world?
Yeah, I think that there's, one of the things that we talk about and invest a lot in aggressively in our fund is how the majority of GDP, or kind of just national production of every country, most of it is right now not in the technology sector, right? It's in manufacturing, construction, real estate, agriculture, healthcare, things like that, transportation. And most of these industries have a lot of potential for AI to make them much more efficient, develop new business models, and kind of seed innovation of startups. And we think of it a lot, kind of industrial revolution, when kind of large mechanized equipment became possible. Like most of the Fortune 1000 companies that we have right now were built during that time, off of a wave of technology at that time. And I think AI is enabling another wave that's very similar. So we're seeing a lot of companies being built. There's a lot of examples of companies that I think are very interesting. Like people have already mentioned Megvii a couple of times on this call. Even though they're most well known as a kind of facial recognition company, actually a lot of their revenue and a lot of their product development in the last few years has been in warehousing automation. So they provide warehouse automation services and tools based off of computer vision, and that's really enabled a step change in efficiency when it comes to like kind of local deliveries and things like that in China. In the U.S., there's many examples as well. Many of them don't kind of call it, like we were talking about earlier, that line of what defines AI is very difficult to draw. But they're basically using automated systems and software to improve the efficiency of these industries. So it's hard to compare kind of apples to apples between what's happening in China versus the US versus other countries. I think by and large, the kind of trajectory of what we see in technology companies in the US looks very different from in China. So in the US, typically a lot of companies focus on building technology, and then they supply that technology to incumbents in these different industries as kind of software providers or technology providers. And that makes scaling a little bit slower, but at the same time, they're able to work with kind of a large variety of different kinds of environments. In China, what's much more common from what we've seen is technology companies become vertically integrated very, very quickly. So they start with some new, let's say warehousing automation system. And instead of trying to convince other people to build warehousing their systems, go and build their own, they partner with the bank, get a loan, build their own warehouse that performs at kind of 3 or 4x the efficiency of everybody else. And so they scale much more quickly because the only constraint in that case is generally capital. And in the last few years, capital has been easy to come by. But I think, that model that we've seen happen in China is also much more easily applicable to other countries. So, in Southeast Asia, in parts of Africa, in parts of South America, leveraging kind of access to cheap capital, it's possible for technology companies to vertically integrate and build their own kind of end-to-end technology-driven solutions, let's say for mining or construction companies or farm, managers or distributors or whatever it might be. So, those are kind of what I see as some of the major differences. And I think that we're right, at the early innings of this process, and we're excited to see, over the next 10 years, we a lot of these get very
Cool. Ray, I want to come back to you with a question that you asked us about, or that you told me about before the call, which was you mentioned some interesting ways that Pinduoduo is using AI on the supply side. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's just like sort of one small example. Sorry, by the way, I got cut out earlier. Hopefully it doesn't happen again, but my husband and I are both Zooming all day. So one of the examples I wanted to give was, it's not just for Chinese internet companies. It's not just about optimizing their own internal processes, and especially, and also like when people think of AI, they think of TikTok doing the AI recommendation engine and whatever, which is really just, facing the consumer or the demand side. But companies like Pinduoduo, actually from the very beginning really has been utilizing the data they gather, and they're calling it AI. But yeah, like someone said, it's questionable if it's true AI, but it definitely has machine learning and math in it, where they're taking the data and informing the supply side as well. So one of the new initiatives that they've been pushing is how they're helping farmers, right? It's not just getting farmers onto the platform and then distributing the goods on a demand way efficiently, but also they're informing farmers what to grow and when. So now they're optimizing basically the entire chain. And they've been doing that regularly with their manufacturing goods, but now they're extending into some of these arguably even more complex, even more data intensive processes like farming.
That's fascinating. I mean, if you just think of all the things that come and go, especially, in the US, at least I can speak to the US, hops probably skyrocketed in value as craft beers took off. And then, quinoa came out of nowhere and displaced, all the other grains. And, but quinoa is old news now. It's on to farro and the ancient grains. And it's interesting, if you could aggregate the consumer side data and feed it upstream, you could really, affect things in a faster way, a much more rapid way. That's fascinating to think about.
Yeah, and actually one of the examples they gave was that they were able to really popularize this hitherto not well known, it's not a grain, I think it's a potato of some sort. And then they were able to both sort of drive out on the demand side, but then efficiently teach the farmers how to farm this, when to do it, how to sell it, et cetera, so that it now is apparently a much bigger crop than it was before.
That's amazing. Matt, you mentioned in our kind of prep session for today, the topic of smart cities. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about what defines a smart city as far as you meant it, and maybe a couple cool examples of how that's happening in China. And I don't know, is something similar happening in the US? I don't actually read that much about smart cities in the US, but I imagine there must be some experiments going on somewhere. So if you could talk about it, that'd be great.
Sure. Yeah, and this, of course, gets prefaced with everything that we've said about what is, the boundaries around AI and the kind of hype versus reality distinction, which I think is really important here. But what I sort of spent the most time looking at this was at the Alibaba's Ali City Brain project. And I think the broader vision, the broader goal is a smart city that integrates all kinds of public services into it. But clearly the most practical, immediate use case for this is on traffic optimization. And that's where they've kind of had their like earliest results, or at least the earliest public results, and shared those. So if you want to think about how could AI improve the functioning of traffic in a city, maybe there's two main mechanisms. There's one that's kind of a purely, maybe a, how to put it, it's a purely algorithmic optimization of the traffic lights. It's over time recognizing what the flows of traffic are and creating an optimization that it maybe could be blind to the real world at any given moment, but it is optimized for traffic flows over a period of time. And that's definitely something they're doing. If you want to add a perception layer on top of that, obviously Chinese cities are blanketed in cameras, CCTV cameras, surveillance cameras, and those allow you, one of the big breakthroughs, the benefits, what allows AI to do its thing today is basically it's gotten very good at object recognition, video tracking of objects and recognizing what they are. So if you combine sort of a base layer, which is optimization of traffic lights, this is something, again, that can be done through like traditional statistical methods, but that can also be done through things like reinforcement learning. So you take that as a base, and if you want to add on top of that to make it more real-time and more flexible, you can add the perception layer of knowing exactly what the backups are at any given stoplight at any given time. We know how many cars, how many pedestrians, how many bikes are flowing through this. If people are interested in this, there's plenty of videos online from Alibaba where they kind of show you the view from a computer vision perspective of it tracking, identifying this is a bicycle coming through, this is an old lady, this is a car, this is a truck. And so that's kind of the how to put it, like the intellectual foundations of what a smart city could do within this traffic optimization realm. Thus far, the results are all like self-reported from Alibaba, so take them with a big, hunk of salt. But one of the areas that I think, other than a broad speed up, I believe the number was about an 18% increase in the speed of traffic in their Hangzhou pilot program. What maybe in terms of sort of life-saving technology, what may be more exciting is optimizing specifically for emergency vehicles and emergency responders. So basically allowing ambulances and whatnot to get to the scene faster. So that's kind of the traffic optimization side of a smart city. There is the whole other side that the Chinese government's very interested in, which is the surveillance side of it, which basically calls on the same perception technology. And Chinese cities will often brag about how many thieves they caught, or on a what I think is clearly a nicer side of it, how many sort of missing children or kidnapped children they were able to find and locate through this stuff. But a smart city in the Chinese context clearly integrates both of these things, optimization of services and the surveillance side.
Yeah, I think the surveillance in cities and all the cameras, it's really, a powerful example of, just like Facebook or Google at their fundamental level, it's a trade-off between feature set and privacy. And, we all think we want our privacy, but as soon as you offer me something good enough, I'll trade it right away. And if you're I heard a very powerful story the other day from a speaker on a different webinar we were hosting about a woman who'd lost her child, and she just went to the government office where all the cameras piped into, and they found the kid. And that's a pretty fair trade if you're that woman, for not being able to, start a secret club. For example, you're not going to have much privacy or have any, secrets, but you'll find your kid. And that's sort of a very, intense version of the trade-offs we make all day long, essentially, by using all the apps and payment systems we use to do everything else. So a question I kind of want to throw out to the group and just see who's got a view on it is the economies may be heading into recession. Not maybe, it's a known fact now. All the economies are in recession, at least for the quarter and probably the next quarter. Do we view, how do we as the panel view that affecting funding for things like AI in general, but then differently in each country? Will China have more funding because the government is maybe more interested in AI? Or will the Chinese government focus more on keeping people employed and happy and just kind of forget the AI stuff? And the U.S. moves forward because we have a more robust private sector to fund these types of things or not. But I'll just kind of open that up to whoever's got some ideas.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there. So I guess anecdotally, I can say, we closed 2 deals last week and 2 deals that. So for a lot of companies, funding is definitely still available. I would say investors probably in general will reduce their investment in things that are purely kind of focused on consumer spending, since we expect that to tighten up. But I think when it comes to drastic efficiency improvements that can make industry operate when, like, I'll take an example, like in the mining sector, like we have a portfolio company that can take kind of previously unprofitable mines and mine them profitably because their costs are like 40% lower than everybody else. For things like that, I think recession or no recession, there's a need for those commodities, and if you can mine it for cheaper, then like you have a big advantage. So I think companies with good fundamentals will still get funding. I think investors' bars will definitely be raised. People will be a lot more skeptical type. But I think both in the U.S. and in other countries, like the need is there, and I think there's a lot of dollars to back that up.
Is that mining company in the U.S. or China?
Neither. It's in another country. We haven't announced the investment yet officially, so I can't announce it. But it's in neither the U.S. nor China.
That's cool. We'll come back to that as a specific topic in a little bit. And just to drill down on it a little further, just out of curiosity, when they save the mines money, are they using geological data to direct the digging better, or are they preventing machines from breaking? So they're repairing them or doing better maintenance instead of repairs, and thus their uptime is higher? Or how exactly do they get the cost savings?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of things, but they started out using hyperspectral cameras to optimize the mining path. Basically, they can figure out where the areas of high material density are versus low material density. And instead of what being done, which was kind of manually and then reviewing them in a lab and then using that to update the plan a few weeks later, this is kind of real-time updates. But they moved on from that. They partnered with banks. They started buying up mines that were abandoned by large mining companies because they couldn't mine them profitably. And they increased the top line by about 30%, which effectively increased the bottom line by about 10x or more because the fixed costs are pretty much the same. And by increasing the bottom line about 10x, clearly like the value of that mine is much more than before. So that's a very repeatable model. So they're going after industry after industry after industry, and they're buying these mines. They're buying these mines and all around the world. They're doing this, and technology is one factor. The hyperspectral camera was kind of just where they started. They've moved on from that. There's lots and lots of decisions that need to get made every day in a mine. For example, do I pay extra to expedite this shipment to reach that ship, or do I send it on the train? Do I send it by other means? And all that depends on lots of factors, including like kind of commodity prices of the day and the cost of each of these means of transportation, et cetera. So all of these decisions right now are way too complex for humans to be able to make in real time. And when you automate that, you get huge gains in efficiency.
It's amazing. Ray, I think you were going to chime in on the last one. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to add, just to have some data to support what someone's saying. Basically, in China, you've seen Q1 VC results are out, and it's down about a third. But if you look at the top players, so Tencent, just like the biggest sort of corporate investor, and then Sequoia, one of the largest, most active funds in China, they've actually kept pace, or actually have increased relative to last year in terms of their investment activity. So in that sense, the most active investors are still putting up money, assuming they don't have any capital constraints, as top tier investors generally don't. And then one other thing is, I tweeted this like a couple of days ago, couldn't find it immediately, but there was also activity breakdown by sector. It includes both PE and VC, because in China that's often a little bit mixed up together. But you see this a huge, the number one sector that had capital deployed this past quarter was enterprise software. And that's something that you don't, people have been predicting for many, many, many years, but really it's coming, I think, into bear because of COVID, right? Where businesses are realizing that if I'm not sufficiently automated or digitized, it's a huge risk for me. So it's no longer, a nice to have. It's actually a survival thing. So yeah, I would assume again that chart doesn't break down to which of these enterprise software, players are, doing AI. But as someone said, a lot of these, anything that's really automation probably has some kind of machine learning, AI, whatever in it, and could arguably present themselves as an AI company.
Maybe just chiming in quickly on the kind of like zooming out a little bit on the investment side and also the government support side that you alluded to. I think even prior to COVID, we were kind of reaching the tail end of like a long hype cycle and of sort of a major wash through of government money into the sector that maybe started around 2017, around the time of the government plan. So back then, that was the time when, a lot of very dubious quote unquote AI startups could get funding basically on like the buzzword alone, when government contracts were going out sort of left and right to AI procurement of AI services. And I think a lot of what we've seen over the last like year and a half is a little bit of a sort of sorting out of the wheat and the chaff that came out of that. So a lot of the unicorn companies that Ray listed early on, the big facial recognition companies, ByteDance, and obviously the tech giants, they have kind of risen to a level where they have real revenue. They are a real established player in this field, whereas a lot of the more experimental, theoretical, small scale AI applications have kind of like filtered out and they have already gone through their cycle and maybe failed or closed shop. So I think we have kind of maybe gone through that big boom and to a mini bust, or at least a cooling down cycle. And now going forward, maybe some of the investments, like a lot of the big players that Ray mentioned, or a big player like where Saman works, these people they still have the capital, they still have the knowledge to do some of the separating of the wheat and the chaff, but probably a little bit less wasteful spending, wasteful investment, just based on a buzzword.
Totally. I mean, I think that's it. All super interesting stuff. And when I think about funding in the US, particularly, you got to wonder how much of it's efficient. The amount of like $30 million Series A's going on for companies that don't even have revenue, there's just a lot of stuff happening out there that's highly speculative. It's pure speculation. A lot of it seems. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens if the economy turns down. That said, there's still, more than $2 trillion of dry powder in the private equity and VC universe, and it's got to go somewhere. So
I think also one thing just to add to that is also like VC and PE have, the benefit of being relatively long-term investors. Like they're not looking for returns next quarter or next year even. We make investments with kind of an 8-year to 10-year, expectation on return. So given that, like, these cycles in the world are of course, being conscious of them, but don't dictate what we invest in or don't.
Sure. So another question, this one comes from a audience member. What do we know about the social credit system in China as it relates to AI? Is the government using AI, or is it just sort of like a one-way collection of data for now, and we don't know how they're using it? And to what degree is it available to or being coordinated with private sector companies?
I'll jump into the void briefly. Social credit system is not what I study. And basically much of what I claim to know on it comes from reading other researchers who I'll just shout out here. Shazeda Ahmed currently at Stanford, HAI, what does HAI stand for? Human-centric AI, I believe. She's done a lot of great work on social credit system. And if I'm trying to, from my own memory, recall her talking points on this, it's that a lot of the social credit system stuff is, quote, dumber than advertised. There's a heavy incentive to say, oh, we as the government, we're integrating all these complex data streams and making very sophisticated judgments on the creditworthiness of each individual in Chinese society. But in reality, it's often more of a simply counting up plus and minus points based on certain activities. So it's a lot dumber than advertised. Shazida, I apologize if I've phrased your research wrong, but I would recommend people read her on this subject.
Great.
I was going to interject briefly and say, like my friend Ed Sander in the Netherlands, actually, but he has written a lot on the social credit system. I'm not sure if all of it is in Dutch or in English, but you can probably Google translate a lot of it. And it's exactly as Paul said, from personal experience as well, basically that a lot of these social credit systems are actually application specific. It's really like the company trying to optimize some kind of behavior for their users and reward good behavior on their platforms. And that sometimes gets mixed up in the media with what the municipal governments are doing. And a lot of what the municipal governments are doing and what the companies are doing privately gets lumped together. But actually, there's probably more activity on the private sector side.
So the social credit system may just be like a giant Reddit upvote, downvote thing, and not as much AI as maybe.
I mean, I think it's more of like a rule-based system, right? Like I don't know a ton about exactly how it works, but my understanding is it's not super different scores in the sense that there's like some things that are weighted more heavily and certain things that are weighted less heavily, and the things that are weighted more heavily are considered for certain types of actions. Other things are weighted for different kinds of actions that you want to use that score for. So when you want to get a car loan versus a house loan, like the things that they look at are going to be a little bit different.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know the details of how it works, and I'm just
sure. So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I want to segue into what may be our last topic for the day, and it's one that all of you chimed in on pretty interestedly when we were talking yesterday, which is around the human beings that make up the international AI community and how that might play out, under the current political tensions. We've already talked about the researchers and how a lot of the big developments were made, in highly international research environments. But what about the entrepreneurs? A lot of them are international people by their just kind of very nature. What do you all see for that community of entrepreneurs in the both right now, but if things were to get worse, politically speaking, what does that look like? How's it going to play out? I will start calling on people.
I think Baidu should go first because
the people who fund the companies
invest in this population. I only have some anecdotes, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that's a little bit hard for me to comment on because I think that the human element has there's a lot of factors. I think one of the things that the way that we see it, at least, is academia or in kind of commercial sphere, like collaboration is like the most kind of necessary element of rapid growth. That's the same in pretty much every industry, but it's particularly true in fast moving industries where the iteration cycles are on the order of weeks and months rather than kind of decades in maybe some other industries. So given that context, I think the way we see it is any companies that are able to leverage the smartest people in a space from all around the world are at a significant advantage from the ones that aren't. There's Chinese researchers in the US, there's American researchers working in China or collaborating with China, and there's a growing population of like AI researchers that are educated all around the world that are also contributing to this kind of global effort. So I think it depends really what the ultimate goal is. As kind of like a optimist in the future, like the background I shows is kind of like what I hope the future will look like. And scarier, but it's cool too. But I think with this kind of optimism for the future, like I think I would encourage kind of all companies as much as possible to think more about collaboration and the advantages that collaboration brings and throughout history has shown to bring, rather than kind of this like segregation between industries and countries.
Good. I'll go next. My background is the Blade Runner 2049. So it's because it's one of my favorite movies, not because I want this future to happen. And it's AI themed. So, but anyway, what I was going to add is basically, I think with the new generation of Chinese companies, again, like I don't focus on AI. I look at a lot of just consumer internet or whoever's just like, big in China, because I sort of generally look at the top 50, let's call it, internet companies in China, that you can see, a lot of people are now talking about ByteDance and how they've effectively internationalized, right? Again, that's still kind of shaky depending on how policy shakes out, but it's very different from, it's been like massively more successful basically than any of its predecessors, aside from like what people might have done from an acquisition perspective. This is sort of organic growth. And, people in Silicon Valley are always talking about like, oh, Chinese company have so much data because you have like 1 billion people, but they always neglect to, say the fact that like Facebook and Google and, US internet giants are global companies and they have like 2 billion, 3 billion users, right? So if you take WeChat, which is like penetrated all of China, that's still just 1.1 billion. So unless you internationalize, you're going to find yourself like restricted to like 1 billion or 1 point something billion people. And so at least there is a lot of talk that the next generation of Chinese internet companies that are going to be successful have to be global. And with that in mind, I imagine a lot of collaboration is going to be necessary.
Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Just quickly chiming in, obviously, very much in agreement on the importance of collaboration here in the U.S. and, the self-harm that is done by a lot of recent immigration restrictions and stuff like that. I think maybe it's also important, just kind of piggybacking on what Ray was saying there, it's important to think about, it's easy to beat up on the US government on this side, but it's also important to recognize what a challenge the Chinese government will have in both attracting talent into China and then also kind of spreading its companies globally if it does not have a diverse population at home, or a population at home that can kind of help with that internationalization process. I think there has been some success. Basically, the market share of Chinese apps in the developing world has grown substantially over the last few years. And that's evidence of success. That's evidence that there's not some kind of like unbreakable glass ceiling whereby everybody in Indonesia just automatically prefers US apps and prefers US companies. I think that that's a bit of a myth for US companies to rest on. But I do think, for all the necessary criticism of US policy on this front, I think it's also important to recognize how much the Chinese government is shooting itself in the foot when it comes to attracting international talent. Like, it wasn't that long ago that you had, some of the top AI researchers in the world going to work for Chinese companies. Andrew Ng going to work for Baidu. That was a huge coup in terms of top talent. And that's something that's kind of hard to imagine happening right now if the researcher is not maybe a Chinese-born, Chinese national returning home. So I do think that that's important to keep in mind. And I think China could do a lot on that front to, burnish its image and make itself a more welcoming place.
Great. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. One thing that Ray mentioned, which is fascinating, is that indeed, even if you get the whole Chinese market, that's quote unquote just 1.4 billion people, and companies like Facebook and Google count their users in the many billions because they're just so foundational to the global internet. Maybe in the last minute or two, Saman, you mentioned this yesterday as well. You mentioned that a lot of this stuff is playing out outside of China, both on a competitive basis, but even on a collaborative basis. And I was wondering if you had any kind of final thoughts on outside of either country, what we might watch for there.
Yeah, I think um, the example that I gave earlier on is very representative of what we're seeing. These are companies that are being formed in throughout Southeast Asia, throughout South America, throughout Africa and Australia and other places, where kind of a lot of this kind of national production of all of these countries relies on uh, you know labor, relies on kind of exports and precision in terms of manufacturing and all types of technology-driven kind of efficiencies. And when a lot of the kind of previous bottlenecks are removed, I think the opportunity presents itself for companies to be built using all of those kind of new resources. So I think that there's a really big chance for them to leapfrog, just like China leapfrogged a lot of the kind of development milestones that happened in the U.S. Like throughout the 90s, they were able to really quickly industrialize because of the availability of technology and capital. And the same thing's going to happen now again in a lot of other countries. So we've been investing a lot outside of both the U.S. and China. We're seeing honestly more Chinese investors taking that approach than American investors. But there are some American investors that are looking at that as well. A lot of the talent is coming from both the U.S. and from China and other places, or people from let's say Indonesia or Brazil who spent some time studying in the States have now gone back and are starting companies there, especially as the economy is doing what it's doing. They see those opportunities more clearly. So we think that we're kind of at the precipice of a kind of huge increase in efficiency all around the world, and lots of big companies to be built.
Very cool. Well, I think Paul is about to jump in here and moderate us right into the next panel. So I'll preemptively wind things down, and just want to thank everybody one more time for your time today, both our audience members and our panelists, and look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all.